Hello, everybody, and welcome to Talking for a Living. I am Jake Brown. With me is Huon Pitts. Excuse me. Let me try that again. Hello, everybody. My name is Jake Brown. This is Huon Fitzpatrick, and we got Phil Jubileo with us today. You may know him with Quinnipiac Hockey and ESPN Plus, and he's done a lot of stuff with hockey over the last 25 years, and Phil's here to talk about it. Phil, first off, how did you get into hockey?
How did I get into hockey? That's an interesting story. So I grew up in New York City. So
Hmm.
first and foremost, I'm a very excited New York Knicks fan because they just won the NBA championship. However, I did not really follow hockey as a kid. It really became an opportunity for me when I had the chance to start broadcasting it. For a short time in New York City, I was the studio producer for the New Jersey Devils at WABC Radio, but you didn't really have to be a hockey knowledgeable person to do that. You had to know how to run the board, and I was good at that. But years later, when I was working in minor league baseball, I was presented with an opportunity to start calling games in the USHL for a team in suburban St. Louis. We were tasked with doing the marketing and promotion for the team. They really didn't have a front office. They kind of subleased those office functions to the baseball team that I worked at. So I was handed the chance. They were like, well, you call the baseball games. Would you like to do the hockey games? And I was like, okay, I'll do it. And I fell in love instantly. That was about 25 years ago. And I've been in love with hockey ever since. And just calling hockey is my favorite thing to do when I'm not spending time with my family.
That's awesome, and that's great. What we were talking about in our previous episode that we just finished recording a few hours ago about the differences between calling baseball and hockey because we're both baseball guys, and I know how difficult hockey is because I've called a few games. Um, it is a completely different animal than hockey because you have to memorize the board. There's all the action happening throughout the periods, and um, thing at baseball is just there's a lot of long pauses. How did you transition from going to a primarily baseball broadcaster into a longtime hockey broadcaster?
I'll be honest, it was really easy for me, and I'll explain why. So when I first started getting involved in broadcasting, and I was at Fordham at school, and I called football and basketball mostly. Baseball came in a little bit later. And for me, baseball is a much harder sport to call than hockey because you just mentioned it, the long pauses, all of the airtime that you have to fill. And when I worked for the River City Rascals in the Frontier League, I was working games by myself. So I didn't have an analyst that would help out with the broadcast. And so you're really there as the play by play announcer and the analyst, kind of doing a Vin Scully, so to say, where he always worked alone with the Dodgers for just about the entirety of his career. So for me, being able to call hockey where it's constant action, I'm able to stay on top of the play. Over time, memorizing players became pretty easy for me. Once you do something long enough, it becomes easier. Your brain kind of rewires itself to do what you need to be able to work the game. And I really like the action of it. That's really what excites me is the fast pace of the game, the action of the game. Now, baseball, if you're asking me what sport do I enjoy watching the most, I'll tell you it's baseball as opposed to hockey. I do love watching hockey too. I love calling hockey, but I love watching baseball. And if I were asked to call baseball again, I would certainly do it. But it's a challenge in a different way. The action itself is really easy. There's not a lot that goes on, but it's in between the pitches. And that's where the really good play by play announcers show their skill and their ability, the ability to carry an audience, to not just have a conversation essentially with yourself, but to be able to kind of, carry that air, that whole entirety of the broadcast by yourself or maybe with a color commentator too.
Hmm. And Ewan, do you have anything for us?
Yeah, kind of similar to the hockey question. I'm kind of just curious on how you got into broadcasting as a whole. Like, obviously, you did student radio when you were in college. Did you know going into school that you wanted to be a broadcaster? How did that kind of start?
So for me, when I was in high school, first off, I was really shy as a kid. And when I come across people today, they find that hard to believe. But I was kind of a quiet, shy kid. So this was really climbing out of my what I would consider as a teenager to be my element of being kind of like the shy closed off kid, but I really loved sports. And starting in high school, I was told about a program on WFUV, which is the university station for Fordham University. That's where I went to college. I grew up in the Bronx, by the way, and it was on Saturday and Sunday nights from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. The show's called One on One. It's still on, actually. And I would call the show. I was a regular caller throughout my time at high school, probably starting in my sophomore year. And as I was thinking about where I wanted to go to college, I really wanted to go to Fordham because I wanted to work at WFUV. I wanted to host the weekend sports talk show. I wanted to be one of those rotating students. I thought that would be an absolute blast, even though I knew I was going to be way out of my element at first, trying to become familiar with that. And uh, that's really where it started for me as far as why I wanted to get into sports. However, I wasn't necessarily going to go to Fordham and then eventually work as a professional sportscaster. At the time, I was considering going to law school after and becoming a sports agent. That's really kind of where I was thinking at that time my career path was going to be. But eventually, I really kind of soured. You know, sports agents, they're not. It's not like it is today. It's a little bit of a different world, especially when you were getting involved with younger. Now with the world of NIL, it's all above board and it's legal and you can do all these things as an agent with college athletics. But back then, you were starting to kind of work in the shadows and trying to get those athletes before they were really well known. There was a lot of kind of stuff that went on that really soured me on it. And once I started working at WFUV and really began to get involved, I thought, okay, I could get into this for a living. And then the final kind of like what sealed the deal was working with Marty Glickman, who was our sports broadcast coach. Marty was kind of before my time. He retired when I was a freshman. He was, his last job was calling the New York Jets on radio. But if you look him up on Wikipedia, you'll see his long, illustrious career as a sports broadcaster and as an athlete. Before that, he really taught us a lot about play by play. And I was hooked. I was instantly hooked to wanting to be a play by play announcer. And that is really where I started to see myself more so than being a sports talk host.
Yeah, and sports talk host again, like similar to what we're doing now. This isn't on any airwaves or anything, but it's changed a lot
Mm-hmm.
into these podcast mediums. Anybody in the world can, if they have a microphone and a friend or two, they can talk about anything. And I want to know from your perspective, as someone who grew up before podcasts existed really on the internet, how you've seen that sports talk host landscape change.
Oh, it has changed considerably. So let's think about this for a second. And it's a great question, by the way, Jake. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
When I think about when I was coming up, I was just about a teenager when WFAN became the first all sports talk station in the country where I grew up in New York City. So it was very new. Now, there were other talk show hosts that covered sports around the country, but it wasn't a singular format. So starting from 1986, 1987, thereabouts, when you had a single sports talk station with nothing but 24/7 coverage in sports, that was the first step. And then you eventually got to the point of the internet and people being able to not necessarily host podcasts the way that you do today, but to be able to share their thoughts and opinions somewhere online. I think back to message boards. It wasn't social media like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. it was message boards, and you would go, oh, I'm a big New York Mets fan, I'm going to find this New York Mets fan message board, and I'm going to, kind of debate on topic threads with people that are like-minded, such as myself. And that was kind of the kernel that really started to become eventually what would be social media. For me, I had a job. I lived in Seattle before I got into minor league sports. I lived in Seattle for about 3 years. I worked at a company called Talkspot.com and World Stream Communications. We were one of the very first internet streaming, by and large, radio stations. It was a little bit more than that. They tried to be all things to everybody, where it would be, I'm hosting a show that would sound like a radio show on the Real Player or Windows Media Player Live. And we'd have a chat room so people that were tuning in can kind of chat their thoughts back and forth. And they were trying to be a radio show with a message board and with some interactive graphics. And sadly, it was ahead of its time, probably by a good 5 to 10 years, because the technology really was ahead of what people were able to get to at home. That was my first taste of what eventually would become podcasting, in a sense. We did our shows live, but you could go back and access the archives of the show. And what is an archive of a radio show? It's essentially a podcast, right?
Right.
So then move forward with social media and the ability to, with YouTube and eventually other platforms, be able to literally take a microphone and just start either recording a show or streaming it live. And now everybody can have their voice heard, have their opinion heard, and the startup cost per se to become a podcast host is extremely low. Whereas when I went to, college, you basically had to be someone that went to college, and then you hope to get your foot in the door at a radio station, eventually maybe get on the air, probably in a small market, and then you try to move up. So it was a lot more competition for relatively few spots. And now there are probably many more people interested, but to just kind of get started doing this, there's really no competition because anyone can get a podcast going in a matter of minutes.
Yeah, of course. And when you were talking about that radio show in Seattle, which I used to live in Washington State, Seattle's awesome. I love it there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I it like what you were describing to me is something like Twitch or
Mm-hmm.
like YouTube Lives or th
Yes.
those are things we have now, and it like back 20, 25 years ago, it just seemed like something like you said, a way ahead of its time.
It was. And the place where I worked, I would go into an office and it would be like going to work at the radio stations that I used to work at before moving to Seattle. There was a studio, there was a control room, there's an audio mixer. It's a whole big to do setup. We would be able to do quote unquote live stream at venues. I remember doing a few concerts that way and even doing some sports. I remember calling a Seattle Sounders game,
Mm,
covering for the Sounders guy. They didn't have a radio contract. They were doing the interactive streaming from World Stream Communications, and we had what was called
really?
Studio in a Box. Now, Studio in a Box wasn't really just a small box, it was like a giant crate. It was like this big, thing that you would roll on wheels, and it was like, 3 feet wide by 4 feet high. And it was basically all the components of a remote studio in a box, and then you would plug it into a network cable and stream audio and video. So it wasn't compact. And now I think, oh, if I want to stream a video live, I could just do it right on my phone, and I'm streaming live on YouTube or whatever I want to stream on Twitter or Instagram Live, any of those things. And the technology has become so easy to get to that point that it really does blow your mind.
You got anything?
Yeah, I was just kind of going back to you're mainly a hockey guy. You've done some minor league baseball in the past. How important do you think it is now for young broadcasters like us? I just graduated from college a month ago, so I'm looking for jobs. How important do you think it is to kind of have everything under your belt in terms of sports called and then maybe eventually find a way to focus on one or two sports? Or do you think it's okay as a young broadcaster if you want to just say, oh, I want to be a basketball guy, just go and be a basketball guy?
I think everybody's a little bit different. People have strengths and weaknesses in their broadcasting. If you're not super knowledgeable about a particular sport before you go out and call the sport, you want to learn the rules, you probably want to get some practice. For me, it's really I was trained as a play-by-play broadcaster, and the training that I learned really helped me to work any kind of sport possible, even if I wasn't terribly familiar with it. I could kind of fake it till I make it type of thing. I'll give you an example. One of the other sports that I do is women's rugby. I call women's rugby for Sacred Heart University. It's only a couple of games a season because the schedules aren't very big. Uh, I don't really know all that much about rugby. I know more now than I did a couple of years ago when I started doing it. But at the time, I was offered the assignment basically because no one else wanted to do it. And there were other sports that they had covered, and they're like, hey, we've got some rugby games. And I had some free weekends before the start of hockey season, so I did a bunch of research and got hockey for rugby for dummies, and started watching old rugby games and got a handle on the rules and the basic pace of play, and I went out and did it. So I think for any play-by-play broadcaster, if you want to call games, it shouldn't necessarily matter when you are young in your career what sport that is. Does it mean that sometimes you're going to fail spectacularly? Absolutely, it will. Everybody does. I think that's part of the growing pains, and no one, whether you are new to this business or experienced, should be afraid to fail. Don't ever, turn down an assignment because you think, oh, I'm not going to be that good at it. Maybe you won't be, but that's okay because it's an opportunity to learn. I think any type of where it's not your best work, there's always something to take away from it and learn down the line.
What are some, when you're a young broadcaster, you're probably going to start in middle of nowhere areas, towns in the flyover states that no
Mm-hmm.
one thinks about. Um, how do you, as a veteran broadcaster now, how would you, what advice would you give to somebody like ourselves or one of our listeners who might end up in one of those towns starting off in their career?
I can tell you, I was one of those people that started off in flyover country. Now, I had a couple of other broadcast jobs before going to work in minor league baseball. But right before I went to Seattle for, it wasn't really quite a year, I was in central Iowa in a town called Tama, Iowa, at a station called KZAT, which is now a Spanish radio station, but it wasn't when I was there. It was a fairly new classic hits radio station. And I was hired as their sports director. And I took the opportunity. I left New York City. I left the producing job at WABC, which is, at the time was the biggest talk radio station in New York City. And I left that because I wanted to work full time on the air. I wanted to call games and get reps and do these things that I wasn't going to get that opportunity in New York City, certainly not at WABC. And it's different than today because there weren't all of these colleges streaming all of their sports. That just wasn't a technology which existed back then. So most colleges would broadcast, in decent college markets, your basketball, your football, and then depending on the conference, some of the bigger conferences would do baseball as well. And that was really about it. So I took a sports director job in a small market to kind of mirror that experience. And in my time there, I had a talk show. I did a ton of high school basketball. I did softball and baseball. I left before the football season had started, so I didn't quite get the chance to do football. And then even during all of that, the afternoon DJ left, and I was the afternoon DJ for most of my time there spinning records, which is something I had never done, but they just handed me the keys and said, have at it. And it's such a great experience because at these smaller stations, you have the opportunity as a one-man band to learn so much in a really short period of time. If you're at the kind of station, if it's small and it's local, oftentimes high school sports is a big part of their programming. So you get to learn a lot about the art of play by play in a short time, and maybe other facets as well of the radio station. Some of these young broadcasters have to go out and sell advertising, or they have to go and do news, or host a morning show or an afternoon show the way that I did. So it is a great opportunity. No one should be really scared of it. Now, with that said, I don't suggest spending the rest of your life there unless that's really where you want to settle down. But if you get there for a year or two and then really start to concentrate on building contacts in the industry, making your demo tape as strong as humanly possible so that you can move up markets, that's a pretty good approach. And a lot of people have done that over the years.
Anything you got, Human?
Yeah, I think just maybe before we head out of here, you've been doing this a long time. You've got a lot of sports under your belt. What would you say to someone, our listeners, a piece of advice for either starting in hockey, if that's what they want to do, how to get a start in hockey, or just one piece of advice in general for starting in your career and kind of jumping off from there?
I think for anyone, it's find an opportunity where you can get reps. For many of the younger broadcasters that I'm seeing, they're finding the right university college environment for them to get started. But a lot of them now are even starting when they're in high school and working at their high school, either with their athletic director or a teacher, to find opportunities to broadcast the sports at the school they attend. Here in Connecticut, it's actually surprising. There are several really good high school programs for young sportscasters where they get an opportunity to do play by play in color on live events that get streamed throughout the high school season. And in some of the schools in Fairfield County, they do really good and do really some really good productions. In fact, I just called last week the state boys lacrosse championships for one of the divisions, the double L division in Connecticut, which is the largest one. And I also did their semifinals. And in preparing for the game, I hadn't done much lacrosse, and I hadn't done any lacrosse this year. And the previous lacrosse games I called were at, yeah, I did some Sacred Heart, I did some Quinnipiac lacrosse. So I really wanted to kind of prep up for the broadcast. So one of the first things I always like to do is go back and find games from this season featuring the teams that are going to play. And I came across a previous game. The first game I was calling involved two teams that had already played each other 3 times. So I got one of those games with those two teams. This is great because I can prep for both teams at the same time and learn the guys. And they were students calling the game, and they were fantastic. They were really good. And I'm like, I don't even know if I was that good when I finished at Fordham. But again, it was a different time. Kids now get so many opportunities to do reps. Now, if you're in an environment where you don't have those opportunities to call games on an actual broadcast level, bring an iPhone, record audio with the game, do a call. You know, it doesn't, no one has to be watching or listening to get practice. Call games off the TV. A lot of people do that. I have a friend of mine, Rob Ford, who calls games for the Houston Astros. He's their radio broadcaster. We work together for different teams in minor league baseball. And when he finished college, he went to Syracuse. The summer after he finished college, he went to, and he's from New York City too. He went to Mets games. He would just buy a really cheap seat in the upper deck, bring his tape recorder with him, and for almost the entire summer, just called games into the recorder. And he used the broadcast audio from those demos to get his first pro job in Yakima, Washington. And from there, he went to the Frontier League. And then a couple of years after that, he's in the major leagues with the Houston Astros. So anyone can get their start. Technology, as Jake, you mentioned, it's so easy to get these things going nowadays. There's a young guy on Twitter. I wish I remembered his name. He might be breaking some rules in doing it. That's for him to decide. He's been broadcasting audio feeds of every Stanley Cup playoff game. And now he's doing the Calder Cup games. And yeah, he does it remote. He has a great setup. And then he does kind of highlights from those broadcasts and he posts them online. I think he's doing it on Twitch. Maybe he's doing it on YouTube. I don't know. I'm not watching him live, but his highlight reels are really good. He's finding an opportunity for himself to get reps and improve. And I find nothing wrong with that. I think that's great.
That's amazing. And it's probably something that us or, someone at home can take to heart. Like I didn't get a baseball job this year, so I've been watching Nationals games and
Hmm.
calling it from my iPhone. It's
There you go.
creating your own opportunity, even
Hmm.
if no one's listening. All right, Phil. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I think we could have gone forever on this, but want to keep it down to about 30 minutes. So thank you so much, Phil, for joining us, and we'll talk to you some other time. We'll keep listening.
JQ, and thank you so much for having me, and good luck in your broadcasting journey.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Phil.